In 2009, at a science fiction convention in South Carolina, a paranormal researcher named Fiona Broom made a discovery that had nothing to do with fiction. She had been discussing Nelson Mandela, the South African anti-apartheid leader, the man who spent 27 years in Robben Island prison, and she mentioned offhandedly that she remembered his death. Not his death in 2013, from a respiratory infection, surrounded by family, after 2 decades of freedom and one term as president of South Africa. She remembered him dying in prison sometime in the 1980s, and she remembered it in detail: the news coverage, the public grief, a speech delivered by his widow, riots in certain cities. What stopped her wasn't the memory itself. It was the response from the people around her: security staff, other attendees, strangers at a convention who had no reason to share a hallucination, all of whom said they remembered exactly the same thing. Same decade, same prison, same widow's speech, same riots. None of it happened, and yet there they were, a cluster of people with identical, detailed, confident memories of an event that the historical record insists never occurred. Broom went home and began documenting the responses she received online, and hundreds of people wrote in with the same false memory, some of them while Mandela was still alive, still giving interviews, still very much present in the world. The memories weren't vague. That is what separates this from ordinary forgetfulness, from the casual misremembering of a date or a name. These were constructed recollections, complete with emotional texture, with images, with the particular atmosphere of a news broadcast seen through the eyes of a child or a teenager in the 1980s. The people who held them weren't confused about whether they had heard something once. They were certain they had witnessed a historical event. And they were wrong, in a way that science has not yet been able to fully explain, and that some refuse to accept as an explanation at all. The cognitive science framework is straightforward, if unsatisfying. Memory is not a recording. It is a reconstruction, rebuilt each time it is accessed, vulnerable to suggestion, to repetition, to the expectations embedded in culture and context. Confabulation, the brain's tendency to fill gaps with plausible invented detail, can produce memories that feel indistinguishable from genuine ones. And when false information circulates widely enough, it can be absorbed by individuals who never consciously encountered it. Source confusion compounds the effect. A person who heard something in passing, half asleep, half watching a screen, may later recall it as something they witnessed clearly. These mechanisms are real. They are documented. They explain a great deal. The rival explanation favored by Broom herself and by a persistent community that has grown around her discovery is considerably harder to test. That certain memories are accurate, that they reflect events which genuinely occurred in a timeline that no longer exists, and that what feels like error is actually residue from a reality that was somehow replaced or overwritten. No physicist has confirmed this. No experiment has demonstrated it. But it is the theory that makes the phenomenon feel like more than a footnote in cognitive psychology, and it is the theory that has given the phenomenon its cultural weight. Broom named it the Mandela Effect, after the man whose death she remembered and whose continued life she could not reconcile with what she knew. Whatever the explanation, the name stuck, and so did the memories. Millions of people grew up reading the same books, watching the same cartoons, and buying the same merchandise. And almost all of them remember the name wrong. The children's book series created by Stan and Jan Berenstain in 1962 is spelled with an A, Berenstain, and it has always been spelled that way, across every edition, every reprint, every piece of licensed merchandise produced in over 6 decades of publication. And yet an enormous portion of the population, many of them adults who read these books hundreds of times as children, are completely certain they remember an E where that A sits. Not a vague impression, not a half-formed suspicion. A confident, detailed memory of a spelling they insist they saw with their own eyes, on books they held in their own hands. What makes this particular case so difficult to dismiss is the nature of the memory itself. These weren't passing encounters with a logo glimpsed on a grocery shelf. Children grew up with these books. Parents read them aloud at bedtime, teachers kept them in classroom libraries, and the name appeared on the cover of every volume in a series that eventually spanned over 300 titles. If any name should be lodged correctly in long-term memory, it should be this one. And still the E persists, vivid, specific, and apparently unshakable for the people who carry it. The VHS tape incident circulated widely in online communities dedicated to the phenomenon. A person reported finding an old home recording with a handwritten label that spelled the name as Berenstain, suggesting the false memory had somehow been externalized, written down, and preserved. Physical evidence, they argued, that the spelling had once been different. The label, when examined more carefully, revealed the correct spelling on closer inspection, but the story spread regardless because it captured something true about the psychological experience. People weren't just misremembering, they were misreading. The error wasn't confined to memory, it was happening in real time, in front of the actual object. Psychologists who study schema theory offer a partial explanation for why this particular error is so widespread and so resistant to correction. The suffix stein carries enormous cultural weight in the English-speaking world. Frankenstein, Goldstein, Bernstein, Liechtenstein. It appears constantly, attached to German-origin surnames that have become deeply familiar across literature, history, and popular culture. The Stein ending, by contrast, appears almost nowhere. It sounds incomplete, almost accidental, like a word interrupted before it could finish. When the brain encounters a name ending in those letters, it reaches for the nearest familiar pattern and quietly substitutes it, with no awareness that any substitution has occurred. The family is still out there on shelves, spelled exactly as it always was, and somehow that only makes it worse. Rich Uncle Pennybags has never worn a monocle. Not on the original board game released in 1935, not on any revised edition that followed across nearly 9 decades of continuous publication, not on the box art, the card backs, the tokens, or the promotional materials that have circulated in dozens of countries and hundreds of millions of households. The monocle does not exist. It has never existed. And yet the collective certainty that it does is so deeply embedded, so resistant to correction, that researchers Deepasri Prasad and Wilma Bainbridge designed a formal study around it, presenting participants with cultural icons altered to include incorrect details, and found that a substantial majority of those tested confidently recalled the monocle as a real feature of the character, not a guess, not a maybe, but a remembered fact they would have staked something on. The psychological explanation for why this happens is known as schema theory, and in this particular case, it operates with almost surgical precision. When the human brain stores a memory, it does not always preserve the precise details of what it actually observed. Instead, it builds around a framework of what it expected to see, what felt consistent with the broader context of the image, and what other stored associations reinforced over time. Rich Uncle Pennybags is a caricature of Edwardian wealth, with his top hat, his white mustache, his tailored coat, and his air of cheerful excess. A monocle fits that schema so completely that the brain inserts it without friction. More critically, the confusion is not operating in isolation. Mr. Peanut, the Planters mascot, genuinely does wear a monocle, and he occupies a similar visual register, another well-dressed, anthropomorphized figure of implied prosperity from roughly the same era of American commercial iconography. The brain moves between these images, borrows from one, applies to the other, and then files the result as a first-hand recollection. But what separates this from a simple error is what happens when people are told they're wrong. They don't accept it easily, they push back. They describe seeing the monocle on specific editions, on specific boxes in specific rooms from specific years of their childhood, constructing not a vague impression, but a detailed and defended account of something that never happened. The certainty is not incidental to the phenomenon. It is the phenomenon. Memory does not feel uncertain from the inside, even when it is assembling details that were never there. And yet, if you asked a room full of people to draw him from memory, most would reach for that little circle over his eye without a second thought. The Fruit of the Loom logo has never contained a cornucopia. The logo, which has appeared on clothing tags, packaging, and advertisements for well over a century, has always depicted the same loose arrangement of fruit. Grapes, apples, currants, leaves, gathered together without any vessel, without any basket, without any woven horns spilling abundance across the frame, just the fruit itself, uncontained and unadorned. And yet, when asked to describe the logo from memory, an enormous number of people will confidently describe exactly that. A cornucopia, overflowing, The fruit tumbling from a wicker horn and the way harvest imagery has been rendered in Western art for 2,000 years. A detail so vivid and so consistent across so many separate recollections that its absence from the actua, our logo feels less like a simple gap in memory and more like something that was quietly taken out. What makes this particular false memory so difficult to attribute to the usual explanations? Social media, viral images, online forums spreading misinformation until correction becomes impossible. Is a single piece of evidence from 1973, decades before the internet existed in any meaningful form, when a flautist named Frank Weshy released an album titled Flute of the Loom, a title that was clearly a play on the clothing brand, and whose cover art depicted fruit resting inside a cornucopia, the exact image millions of people insist they remember seeing on the actual logo. The album was clearly a parody, and a parody only functions when its audience already recognizes what is being mocked, which means that in 1973, Weishi assumed his listeners would connect Fruit of the Loom to a cornucopia, an association that should not have existed because the cornucopia had never been part of the logo in any form. The standard explanations for collective false memory rely heavily on the idea that misinformation spreads through repeated exposure, that a wrong image circulates widely enough and long enough that it eventually overwrites the correct one, that social reinforcement does the work of replacing reality with a version that merely feels more accurate than the truth. But the 1973 album removes that scaffolding entirely, because there was no internet in 1973, no viral image, no comment thread where one person misremembered and 1,000 others agreed. And yet the false memory was already present, already detailed enough that a musician built a piece of public art around it, already embedded in the cultural imagination as though it had always been true. A musician in 1973 was already painting it. Darth Vader never says Luke's name. The line that billions of people carry in their memory, Luke, I am your father, does not exist anywhere in the film. Not in any cut, not in any version, not in any print that has ever been released. And the word that feels most essential to the scene, the name that gives the revelation its weight and its intimacy, is simply absent from what Darth Vader actually says. What he says is, "No, I am your father," a correction, a contradiction of Luke's accusation that Vader killed his father, and the name never comes because it doesn't need to. Luke is standing right there, and Vader is speaking only to him. What makes this particular case so difficult to dismiss is not that people misheard a line once in a darkened theater decades ago, but that The Empire Strikes Back has been rewatched, re-released, quoted, analyzed, and dissected more thoroughly than almost any film in the history of cinema. And still the wrong version persists. Not as a fading impression held by people who saw it once in 1980, and never again, but as a vivid, confident, specific memory held by people who have watched the scene dozens of times and would stake something on its accuracy. The correct line is right there. It plays every time, and the brain apparently does not update. Psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky identified a mechanism they called the availability heuristic, the tendency for the mind to assess the likelihood of something being true based on how easily an example of it comes to mind, and what their research revealed, when applied to a case like this, is that the misquote has circulated so widely, appeared in so many parodies and memes and cultural references, been repeated with such frequency and confidence across so many platforms and conversations, that the false version has achieved a kind of cognitive dominance. It arrives faster, it feels more familiar, and familiarity, the brain has decided, is close enough to truth. The correct line has been overwhelmed not by silence, but by repetition of something else. There is a final detail that resists easy explanation, which is that people who have been corrected, people who now know intellectually that the line begins with no, will still sometimes catch themselves reaching instinctively for the wrong version, will still feel, somewhere below the level of deliberate thought, that the familiar phrasing is the real one, that the correction is the anomaly and the misremembering is the original. And that feeling does not fully dissolve even after the truth has been established, even after the clip has been watched again, even after the text has been read aloud and confirmed. The scene exists, unchanged, in every print of that film, and it doesn't matter. Dorothy never says, "I don't think." The line that has been quoted on greeting cards, recited at parties, and typed into millions of internet comment sections runs as follows. "Toto, I've a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore." The contraction is archaic, the phrasing deliberately awkward in a way that belongs to 1939, and it captures something specific about Dorothy's voice. Uncertain, almost embarrassed, speaking to a dog because there is nobody else to speak to. Almost nobody remembers it that way. What people remember instead is a line that is cleaner, more declarative, more confident, and grammatically modern. A line that sounds like something a character in a film should say, rather than something a frightened girl from Kansas actually did say. The difference between the two versions is not subtle. One is a feeling, tentative and interior. The other is a conclusion, stated plainly for an audience. And the brain, it turns out, overwhelmingly prefers conclusions. This is not a case of people mishearing a word or confusing a name. The false version of Dorothy's line requires reconstructing the sentence almost entirely, stripping out the old-fashioned contraction, replacing the admission of feeling with the assertion of thought, and delivering something that sounds as though it was written to be remembered. Cognitive researchers who study confabulation describe exactly this process. The tendency of the brain not simply to forget, but to replace, substituting what was stored with something that conforms more cleanly to expectation. What we expect a famous line to sound like, how we expect a frightened protagonist to announce her displacement, is not what Margaret Hamilton's co-star delivered on set in 1939. But it is what our minds encoded anyway. The deeper pattern, once you notice it, is difficult to ignore. Consider the Darth Vader misquote, where the word Luke was inserted because it made the line feel more addressed, more theatrical. Consider Forrest Gump, where a simile was added to a sentence that contained none. Consider nearly every film quote that has drifted in collective memory. And what you find consistently is that the false version sounds more like a quote, more polished, more portable, more like the kind of thing a screenwriter would put in a film if they were trying very hard. The error is not random noise, it is improvement. The brain does not simply drop information the way a computer might corrupt a file. It curates. It revises towards some internal standard of how things ought to have been said, how a memorable, moment ought to land, how language ought to feel when it is destined to outlast the film it came from. Our brains, it turns out, are not just unreliable narrators, they're rewriters. The line that appears in the 1994 film, delivered by Tom Hanks on a park bench in Savannah, Georgia, is not a simile. It is a declaration, flat and absolute. Mama always said life is a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. The word like is absent, and its absence is not a minor grammatical accident, but the defining feature of the sentence, because without it, the phrase does something stranger and more poetic than a comparison. It collapses the distance between life and randomness entirely, asserting that they are the same thing, that there is no metaphorical separation, no safety of analogy between a human existence and a cardboard box of assorted sweets. That is an odder, bolder, more unsettling claim than what most people remember hearing. And yet it is the one that was actually made. What almost everyone remembers instead is life is like a box of chocolates. A simile so grammatically tidy and emotionally comfortable that it slots into the brain without friction, fitting neatly alongside every inspirational poster and refrigerator magnet that ever reached for profundity on the cheap. And the remarkable thing is not simply that people misquote it. It is that the version they misquote is the one that sounds more finished, more correct, more like what a famous movie quote is supposed to sound like, as though the brain has reviewed the original, found it slightly too raw and philosophically exposed, and quietly inserted the buffer of to restore a safe and familiar distance between the speaker and the claim being made. This is the same pattern visible across almost every major instance of collective misquotation. The false version does not arrive randomly, does not substitute one word for another with no logic behind it, but consistently moves toward what sounds more natural, more expected, more like the kind of thing someone in that moment in that film should have said. Which means that cultural memory is not a passive archive recording, what was spoken, but something closer to an editorial process, continuously smoothing and improving the material it receives. Replacing what actually happened with a version that feels more coherent, more satisfying, more real than the real thing, and then defending that replacement with absolute sincerity and total confidence. Because by the time it surfaces as a memoir, there is no longer any trace of the revision. And yet across decades of references, parodies, and greeting cards, the version nobody said became the one everyone remembers. C3PO has had a silver leg for nearly 50 years. Not in one film, not in an obscure scene, but in every theatrical release of the Star Wars franchise stretching back to 1977, the protocol droid's right leg below the knee has always been silver. A detail so visible, so geometrically obvious against the surrounding gold plating, that it appears in promotional photographs, licensed merchandise, and wide-angle establishing shots that audiences around the world have watched and rewatched across generations. What makes this particular Mandela Effect different from misquoted dialogue or misspelled book titles is that it asks something more uncomfortable than whether our memory for language is reliable. It asks whether we actually see the things we look at, because the people who insist C3PO is entirely gold are not people who saw the films once at a matinee and forgot the details. They are lifelong fans who own the action figures, who grew up with the posters on their bedroom walls, who can recite lines from the films with effortless precision, and yet have no memory, none at all, of a silver panel that occupies several square inches of one of the most iconic characters in the history of cinema. The silver leg is not hidden, it is not ambiguous. In dozens of scenes across multiple films, it catches light differently than the surrounding gold, and still the brain quietly discards it, files it away as inconsistent with the expected image, and reconstructs C3PO as something clean, uniform, entirely gold. The version that matches the mental schema rather than the version that actually exists on screen. This is what cognitive researchers mean when they describe selective visual attention. The brain does not process every element of a visual field with equal fidelity, but instead builds a model of what it expects to see and fills in the gaps accordingly. Which means that for a character as visually familiar as C3PO, whose gold surface has been the defining feature of every poster, every Halloween costume, and every merchandise catalog since the late 1970s, the brain simply has no reason to encode the anomaly, no reason to update the schema, no reason to hold on to the one piece of visual information that contradicts the pattern it is already committed to, and so it doesn't. Across millions of viewings, across decades of cultural saturation, across every medium in which that character S ever appeared. Every poster, every action figure, every frame of film, the silver was always there and almost nobody registered it. Pikachu's tail is yellow. It has always been yellow, solid, unbroken, tapering to a blunt zigzag point with no markings of any kind. And yet an enormous number of people, many of them lifelong fans of the franchise who have watched the television series, played the games, and owned the merchandise for decades, will state with complete confidence that the tip of his tail is black. Not vague confidence. Specific, defended, entirely certain confidence. The kind that makes a person reach for their phone to prove you wrong, only to find that they cannot. The detail feels too precise to be invention, too vivid to be a guess, and that precision is exactly what makes this case worth examining carefully, because the black that people are remembering is real. It exists on Pikachu. It has appeared on every official rendering of the character since his introduction in 1996. It simply does not appear on his tail. Pikachu's ears, both of them, terminate in sharp black tips, a distinctive feature visible in virtually every piece of artwork, every animated frame, and every merchandise photograph ever produced. The characteristic is unmistakable when pointed out, and yet in memory, for a significant portion of the population, those black tips migrate. They travel from the ears, where they have always lived, downward through the image of the character that the brain has stored, and reattach themselves to the tail, which has never carried them. This is a documented cognitive phenomenon that researchers studying false memory refer to as context confusion, the process by which a genuine feature of an object becomes decoupled from its correct location and reassigned somewhere else within the same image. The brain retains that the black exists. What it fails to retain with precision is exactly where. And because the tail, as the most prominent trailing feature of the character, represents a natural location for a marking, the detail drifts there and anchors, feeling not like a mistake but like a memory. The result is a misremembering that doesn't feel like forgetting. It feels like knowing. The black is there, it always has been, just not where everyone seems to remember putting it. These 10 cases, scattered across cartoons, cinema, logos, and history, do not form a random collection of mistakes. What emerges when they are laid side by side and examined without the comfort of coincidence is something far more structured than error. A set of recurring patterns that reveal not just the failures of human memory, but the specific and predictable ways in which the human mind deceives itself, not randomly, not carelessly, but according to rules that cognitive scientists are only beginning to fully articulate. Rules that operate beneath conscious awareness and produce, with remarkable consistency, false memories that feel indistinguishable from genuine ones. The pattern is this: the brain does not simply lose information, it replaces it. When Dorothy's archaic phrasing felt grammatically incomplete, the brain rewrote it into something cleaner and more cinematic. When Forrest Gump's mother made a statement instead of a comparison, the brain inserted the word that made it feel like a proper metaphor, the word that should have been there, the word that made the sentence grammatically satisfying to a mind conditioned by decades of how quotable lines are supposed to sound. When Darth Vader omitted Luke's name at the most dramatic moment in his son's life, the brain, correctly intuiting that a father addressing his child would use that name, supplied it, stitching together a version of the scene that followed emotional logic, even if it violated the actual script. The visual cases follow the same architecture of plausible substitution, operating not on language but on expectation, on the schema-driven assumption that the world should look the way we imagine it looks, that a wealthy Edwardian caricature should wear a monocle because Mr. Peanut does, that C3PO should be entirely gold because gold is the only color we were ever paying attention to, that Pikachu's tail should carry the black that his ears carry because the black is real, it is present in the image, and the brain, encountering a familiar character at speed, files the correct color in an incorrect location and then defends that filing with absolute conviction. The cornucopia that never appeared in any fruit of the Loom logo was already being painted on album covers in 1973, before the internet existed to spread a false image, before social media could circulate a misremembered version, which means something in the human mind reached for that basket of fruit independently, constructed it from nothing more than the logic of what a fruit company's logo ought to contain, and produced a memory so vivid that a musician treated it as documentary reference. Cognitive science has a vocabulary for all of this: confabulation, schema theory, source monitoring errors, the availability heuristic, fuzzy trace theory, the tendency of gist memories to survive long after verbatim memories have decayed, leaving behind only the emotional shape of an experience rather than its precise content. A shape the brain then fills with plausible material drawn from adjacent knowledge, from cultural expectation, from the contaminating influence of every misquote and mislabeled image encountered in the years since the original experience, until the reconstruction feels more real than any recording could, because it carries the emotional weight of something personally witnessed rather than the cold fidelity of something merely documented. But there is another account, one that cognitive scientists dismiss and that physicists regard with varying degrees of patience. And it lives in the corners of online forums and in the original speculation of Fiona Broome, who stood in a convention hall in 2009 and discovered that the vivid, detailed, emotionally textured memory she carried of Nelson Mandela's prison death in the 1980s, complete with news coverage, a widow's speech, urban unrest, was shared in nearly identical form by strangers who had arrived at it independently and who were not confused, not misremembering a vague impression, but recalling something with the full weight of lived experience, something they had watched unfold, something they were certain had happened in a world that insists it did not. The multiverse interpretation, drawn loosely from string theory and the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, proposes that these shared memories are not errors at all, but accurate recollections of a reality that no longer matches the one we currently inhabit. That somewhere in the branching structure of possible histories, the Berenstain Bears exist with an E, and the Tower of Wardenclyffe still stands, and Sinbad starred in a genie film that earned modest reviews and was forgotten by almost everyone except the people who actually saw it. And yet the theory persists because the alternative, that memory is this unreliable, that 10 people who grew up with those books and watched those films and wore that merchandise could be this confidently, this consistently, this specifically wrong, carries its own kind of vertigo. Because the deeper implication of the cognitive account is not merely that we misremember movie quotes or corporate logos, it is that memory is the only instrument we possess for constructing a continuous self, for knowing who we are and what we have experienced and what the world has shown us. And if that instrument operates by filling gaps with plausible fabrications, by editing raw experience into more satisfying narratives, by contaminating genuine recollection with cultural expectation and social reinforcement, then the question is not whether we misremember Berenstain or Berenstein. The question is how far down the contamination goes. How many of the things we know with certainty are reconstructions? How many of the facts we would defend with our lives are the brain's preferred version rather than what actually occurred? Cognitive science says the answer is more than we would like, less than the most extreme interpretation requires, and exactly enough to be unsettling in ways that do not resolve. And if the answer is that we simply cannot trust what we remember, then the most unsettling Mandela effect of all might be our confidence that any of it, happened the way we think it did.